Oh, no worries.
Okay, guys, let's begin with the show today. Welcome to the philosophy chat. And it is 2 p.m. Today we're going to go over transcendental idealism, along with skepticism, with my good friend right here, John. John is a very smart guy, probably smarter than me, ladies and gentlemen. He has a he has a BS in physics, an MA in philosophy, and he's about to start his PhD in philosophy. He's a bit of a Kantian scholar. He knows more about Kant than anyone else that I've at least currently met in real life. Or sorry, not in real life, but on the internet. He also has a lot of other interests within metaethics, epistemology. He really seems to know his stuff, and he's going to be kind of going over with me a few positions on skepticism and how to resolve skeptical issues. Um, We'll also be taking Q&A. I think John has has the chat room ready here on the right side of him, maybe, and
Yep.
be ready to answer some things with me. We'll see who he might do more of the talking. I might do more of the talking. We'll see how it goes. There's a good chance
Yeah.
that he'll override me on a lot of things. So yeah. So if you want to introduce yourself in any other way, John, or is that good, or you want to just get to it?
No, that was perfect. I'm happy to just get started.
Okay, and everyone hears John on the opposite end in the chat. Let's just make sure that everyone can hear you.
Yeah, I want to make sure my voice isn't too low.
Okay, they seem to. I think they hear you. Yes, yes. Johannes from
I'm a
TPC.
little quiet. Okay, here I can maybe put the sensitivity up.
No, no, no. I can turn you up.
Oh,
Yeah,
thanks.
yeah. I just turned you up to higher volumes. Okay, so before we delve into the issues of skepticism today here with John, and John thinks he has some sort of solutions with skepticism with respect to transcendental idealism and some sort of Davidsonian thesis. We wanted to go over transcendental idealism and what transcendental idealism is as a sort of prerequisite to talking about the other ideas. I haven't gotten too much into John and with respect to what we're going to talk about today, so he's going to probably carry it out at the beginning by talking about transcendental idealism. What is it? What are the sort of origins with Kant? If you have a sort of neat introduction for us, John.
Sure, yeah. Well, I think the best way to start would be just with what Kant says in the Transcendental Aesthetic of the Critique of Pure Reason, which is that transcendental idealism is the view that the objects of experience, so everything the whole world that we experience around us, is dependent in some way on our capacity to represent those objects, which is maybe a more straightforward way to put that would be to say that the objects of experience are not things that exist completely in themselves, that exist on their own independently of our perspectives and ways of representing those objects. What that involves then is a host of different possibilities, because of course there's a lot of ways in which that kind of idealism could be construed, some of which are themselves skeptical, some of which themselves would deny the existence of objects outside of us, or be doubtful of the existence of objects outside of us, and others of which, such as Kant's in particular, uh, do not deny the existence of objects outside of us, and in
All
fact
right.
provide a way of vindicating that existence.
Yeah. So just briefly, I guess, going over the distinctions between transcendental idealism and subjective idealism, as you said, this isn't going to be some sort of Berkeleyan thesis about uh, everything as being a sort of idea or an idea in God, that rather there are going to be things existing ontologically separate from our experiences. So there's a sort of dual notion of experience as that which is representing and that which is represented, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's not the sort of Berkeleyan, or sometimes people like to use the word phenomenalist account of idealism would be to outright deny the existence of objects outside of us. It would be to say, yeah, that objects exist not outside of us, but inside of us. They're just ideas in the head, as you put it. And that certainly is very different than Kantian idealism, this kind of transcendental idealism that I'll be
Right.
talking about.
And so, just to briefly go over transcendental idealism a little bit more, there are certain types of phenomenalist readings. I don't know how much you've read about these phenomenalist readings, and you have a different interpretation. Can you go over that a little bit with us, and why you think the phenomenalist reading might be inaccurate?
Yeah, yeah. So folk Kant scholars, I should say, like James Van Cleve and Paul Guyer, will read Kant's talk of objects of experience as appearances and as, in particular, as representations or presentations, what Kant in German calls a Vorstellung. And such phenomenalist interpreters of Kant will read him as saying that to say that objects of experience are mere appearances or are representations is to say that the objects of experience are exactly like those Berkeleyan ideas. They are thoughts of some sort. They are representations in the sense of a mental representation. They are simply items in the mind in some way. And this is a natural reading of the word representation, certainly. But the word Vorstellung in German has other connotations and is in fact ambiguous between these different uh, between a translation as, say, representation, which does sound quite a lot more idealist and phenomenalist specifically, and a translation as, say, presentation, which sounds much more like a sort of direct contact with objects, where what you have when you have a presentation of an object is that the object is presenting itself to you in some way. So it's more suggestive of a sort of perspectivalism, that the objects that you have contact with are being, you're aware of them only from a particular perspective. And so, and that kind of reading of Kant's talk of representations or presentations, I'll just use the word representation just for simplicity, but that kind of talk of Kant's representations makes them into not items of the mind, but a kind of relation between a mind or a subject and something else, which has a way that it is in itself. And so what we end up with is something more like what nowadays in philosophy of perception would be called a relationalist, or perhaps even a disjunctivist theory of perception. John McDowell is a good example of a disjunctivist. John Campbell is a good example of a relationalist. Incidentally, a lot of people with the name John. But the basic idea when it comes to reading Kant's talk of representations in a relationalist way is that we as subjects have a way that we are in ourselves, which is something inaccessible to us, let's say. At least we certainly one of the claims that Kant makes, one of the claims he's committed to, is that our understanding and knowledge of ourselves is on a par in certain ways, and if anything, inferior to our knowledge of objects outside of us. And so likewise, it's we don't have knowledge of ourselves as we are in ourselves, or I don't have a knowledge of myself as I am in myself, independently of any relation to objects. And likewise, that the objects of experience, these external objects, the objects that exist outside of us, are objects that exist as a relation between that subject, that perspective on those objects, and the way that those objects are in themselves. And so what we end up with is a sort of mind dependent, but also mind independent account of what the objects of what external objects are. And most importantly, it's not just that these objects are in some sense mind independent, but also they are objects that multiple different subjects have in common, which is to say that even though the objects exist as a relation between a particular perspective and the way the object is in itself.
So let me just
They
sort of,
also, oh yeah.
yes, yeah. Let me. I don't mean to interrupt you, but let me just sort of, if I can make a sort of an analogy to an example with what you're saying, and maybe this isn't correct, right? This is sort of how I picture it. So going away from this type of philosophy, where generally people consider Kant to be a dual or two world kind of thinker, that is,
Mhm.
our experiences are radically different from how the world is, and going on to a dual aspect view of where our experiences have some sort of ontological identity to the world, but
Mhm.
that identity is just one of having a certain type of epistemic limit. And by epistemic limit, we can sort of characterize this in the sense that, and here you can say that I'm inaccurate and be provocative or something like that, to where we could kind of like draw an analogy between, say, a cat looking at an object and a human looking at an object. Let's say that object is a laptop, right? And there are certain types of epistemic capacities of which a cat has that they won't understand what this object is other than a sort of hard thing that they can sit on. Whereas a human being would obviously understand the sort of various types of properties that are in this object. Oh, looks like someone's at the front door. Hold on. I'll finish this up real quick and then maybe you can enter us through it. So that's the type of epistemic limitation that I'm talking about with maybe our relation to the noumenon, that we have certain types of epistemic capacities, what Kant calls the a priori categories of understanding, that sort of demonstrate what we know, and then the rest, which is sort of be a limitation of our cognitive capacities. Is that about right?
Yes, I think that's part of the picture. Certainly, I think that applies to what Kant has to say in the transcendental logic, the role that he applies to uh, a priori concepts and the way in which a priori concepts serve as conditions for objects of experience. Although I think that Kant goes quite a bit further than that, in particular in the transcendental aesthetic, by not just seeing not just identifying conceptual conditions for objects of experience, but also identifying uh, you might say conditions for the presentation of objects, conditions for even having a visual or tactile or some sort of sensory relation to objects in the first place. Something which is, in a certain sense, although what that certain sense is a little bit tricky, prior to any conceptualization by a subject. And so in that way, although the conceptualization is something which is those conditions, those conceptual conditions are epistemic, they're normative, they're within the space of reasons, as Sellars would put it. They are subject to and introduce normative constraints on what kind of objects can exist, at least for us. They aren't the whole story for Kant. There's always the conditions, as he says, of sensibility. There's the conditions for objects to be immediately presented to us in the first place. And so those conditions would be, I think, very difficult to read as epistemic conditions, although, of course, there are Kant scholars who do read them as such, like Henry Allison, for example.
Yeah, that's the picture that I'm sort of more acquainted with. Sorry, I had to answer my door, so I didn't get everything that you said. So I'm guessing you're rejecting the epistemic conditions thesis, I guess.
Yes, at least as the whole picture. I would say that it is not the whole picture.
Okay.
That there's also the transcendental aesthetic.
Okay. Okay.
So I'm
Um.
interested in answering Agnes Domini's questions.
Yeah. Sure. Go ahead. If you could read it out loud?
Yeah, so Agnes Domini, you ask, is the relational aspect the collapse of subject and object, the German notion of unity? Um, in a way, yes. Part of this is to say that experience is at once a unified whole that involves subject and object on, you might say, equal terms. And it involves the way the subject is in itself and the way the object is in itself, both on equal terms in a sense. But and so in that way, it is similar to a collapse of the subject-object distinction. But at the same time, on this kind of relational view, there is still room. It doesn't need to lead to this, but there is still room at least to draw a subject-object distinction within experience. You might say by abstracting different aspects of experience and identifying those aspects of experience that depend on the subject, and then those would be the a priori conditions of experience. More basically all of the things that Kant talks about in the Critique of Pure Reason, since he has very little to say about uh, the further non a priori conditions of experience. But then those further non a priori conditions of experience are nonetheless then the sensations that are a part of or are aspects of the experiences that we have and our relation to objects on this relational view. So we might say that insofar as we have a relation to objects, insofar as, like, say, I, a subject, have a relation to all these objects around me as they are in themselves, and my experience of those objects just is that relation. And likewise, the objects themselves just are that relation, and I myself am that relation. But nonetheless, the objects and I myself as subject are different aspects of that relation. And so there remains a sort of robust separation of subject and object, nonetheless, within this picture of subject and objects as just different, we might say, poles of a relation. So I don't know if that answers your question, but you also asked afterwards, or mentioned afterwards, level of cognition does not alter the material reality of the laptop, the thing in itself. Levels of cognition in a cat, I mean. Right, as Marty's talk of cats earlier. These are great questions. Thank you. No, thank you, Agus Domini. As far as the altering the material reality of the laptop, say if what I'm having an experience of right now, let's say is this, let's say a computer. The part of this relational picture is that the relata, so the way the object is in itself and the way I as subject am in myself, are inaccessible from within the relation. So you would not be able to identify and accurately describe any features of the way that the object is in itself, or any features of how the subject is in itself. And so in that way, we might say that there's an altering of the way that the object is in itself, the way the computer is in itself, say. But it's important to read, at least, there are some readings of Kant that will regard that altering, if we want to call it altering, as a sort of construction of the world, a construction of objects of experience. And that this is a sort of a similarly skeptical, we might say, reading of Kant, at least similarly close to phenomenalist readings. I should say not similarly close. It is a reading of Kant that is much closer to phenomenalist readings than these more robustly non-skeptical realist readings of Kant, like the one that I endorse. But so rather than reading the quote-unquote alteration of the way the object is in itself by the subject and the subject's conditions for experiencing that object, rather than reading that alteration as a construction of the object, as a creation of the object, as a sort of transforming of something which exists independently of us, and then getting an object out of that, an object of experience specifically. I tend to read this more as just merely introducing perspective into the picture. And so what you then have, so you might say, to use an analogy, and this isn't what the view is, but this is just an analogy for the view. It's kind of like how whenever you see, say, when you see a house, for example, you're never seeing the house as some sort of full, multi-sided, like completely enveloped, I should say, geometric object. You always are only ever seeing one side of the house. And so in your experience of the house and to that extent is a perspectival experience. It's only an experience of one side of the house. And here again, I emphasize this is just an analogy to what I take it is the perspectivalism or the merely perspectival nature of our experience of objects and the objects that we experience. So it's not to say that the relational claim is just to say, oh yeah, all we see are sides of objects, for example. It goes far beyond that. But that gives us that idea, the idea that when we see an object, we only see a side of it, is I think at least analogous to the way in which we have a altered, we might say, view of these objects, which have a way in themselves, but we don't see the way that they are in themselves. We don't experience the way that they are in themselves. And so we don't, what we have in front of us as all these objects, these external objects, these objects in space around us, are essentially perspectival objects. They are objects that exist from a perspective as opposed to in themselves.
And how would you say that this is going to be relating to skepticism in any sort of way? I mean, I know that Kant has some views on skepticism that, against subjective idealism and Brownian skepticism with the, what was it, in the end of the Critique of Pure Reason, you're going to help me, with the antinomies.
Yeah.
But how do you find Kant in relation to just, I guess, modern day skepticism about, knowing anything? All right, how would we combat that with Kant or Davidson or anything like that?
Yeah, well, so at first I would want to limit this to skepticism about external objects. I think there are very different answers that a Kantian would give to, say, moral skepticism, which is, I think, an equally pernicious kind of skepticism,
Okay.
not more so. But if we limit the question to skepticism about the existence of objects outside of us, what I think, to give a sense of Kant's, to give a sense of what Kant's answer to that is, or at least how I read Kant's answer to that to be, and the relation of that to Davidson, which I'll get to a bit later. I think helps to start with what makes this kind of skepticism of the external world seem so appealing. And there's a lot of different ways in which that could be framed, but one particular way of looking at this is to say that all we have are sense data of a sort, or if we don't want to use sense data because that has a certain connotation, all we have in access to epistemically, from our own, as far as what we were able to consciously access, what we're able to actually.
Okay, so you're going towards like a Sellarsian, I guess, thesis, and the idea that we're going to be removing sense data as something that we have privileged access to, or sensations as something that we have privileged access to as an inner state, and instead drop that altogether to getting an idea of an experience as something that's already of external content and always sort of justified within a logical space of reasons? Or is there going to be something more to it than that?
It's going to involve that as a component, because certainly there is a normative component to this, which is, I think, essential if a solution to skepticism is to be provided. But actually, I think the normative component, and so the way in which this our belief in the existence of objects outside of us is going to fit into the space of reasons, as Sellars puts it, is going to have to be something that's ultimately pragmatic, which it is for Sellars as well, I think. But which is to say that it's another way to put this, and this isn't what I was going to get to. I'll get to the actual more substantive response to skepticism after I say this. But what that pragmatic component, or that situating of our belief in the existence of objects outside of us, and so our knowledge ultimately of the existence of objects outside of us in the space of reasons, the denial of that by the skeptic is a moral failure. The skeptic is doing something we might say that's wrong as far as how they're living their life, as opposed to the skeptic making some sort of scientific or epistemic kind of mistake. So that's certainly going to be part of my answer, but my fuller answer from a Kantian direction, and then also from a Davidsonian direction, at least by analogy to Davidson, is going to involve directly talk of what about experience itself guarantees the existence of objects outside of us in a way which does put the objects outside of us, external objects, on a par, or even actually in a more certain, a more epistemically certain position than sense data, as you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I'll get into that.
But you would agree with someone like Sellars, for example, that we need a sort of species or a sort of locution of being or being there instead of just appearing. So I guess an actual a locution of seeings before seeming seeings, or not seeing at all, right? And that we need to sort of develop the idea that we're seeing things before we get the criterion of illusion or error of any sort, right? So the criterion of illusion or error is going to proceed sort of normal everyday experiences. Or would you say that Kant is taking a completely different route here?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly the starting point. I think that Kant builds on. And we might say in particular that in order to draw a seeming and being distinction, a distinction between what seems to be the case and what is the case,
Right.
we have to have some notion of content, specifically the content of our mental states or mental representations. So not in the sense of Kant, but just the content of what we are thinking about
Right.
and what we are experiencing. And to talk of content, of course, is to talk of a what those thoughts, let's say, let's focus on thoughts, what our thoughts are about, basically.
So let me just kind of like square away an example from Sellers then for the audience before you proceed on to there, just to get them
Go for
a
it.
kind of idea of the sort of locution between seeming seeings and seeings. And I've done this in a previous episode, but just for the sake of the audience to sort of realize where we're at and what we're about to what we're about to talk about. So we're trying to address sort of skepticism of external objects and generally the idea of how we're seeing things at all. And the general argument against direct realism or a form of naive realism, right? The first thing that appears to everyone's mind is that we can't just directly see the world in itself all the time, just transparently, because then if that was the case, we could never account for error, right? And so this is the sort of beginning point of skepticism, is the idea that because we're in error, right, we don't know exactly if we can see things, because we might just be seeing things that we think that they're there, because the seeming seeings might be indistinguishable from the seeings. But someone like Sellars or Kant, or at least kind of focusing on Sellars right now, has certain types of ideas like that we need to be seeing things before we think that we're seemingly seeing things. That is, that the locution seeings comes before seeming seeings, or thinking that we're thinking of seeing things that we're not actually seeing, or at least partially endorsing. So he offers a sort of example of David the bow tie salesman. And we can imagine David who works at a bow tie shop. And we can imagine, for the purpose of this thought experiment, as David who has never in his entire life had an error in terms of perceptual content, that he sees everything within his life as it is, right? And so when he says he sees a blue tie, he actually sees a blue tie. When he sees a yellow tie, he actually sees a yellow tie. But one day we can sort of imagine, right, that the lighting within his store changes colors or stops working in such a way, or that makes a blue tie appear to be yellow. And the very first thing that you would expect from David when, say, he's talking to his friend is that he's going to say, well, look at this yellow tie instead of look at this blue tie. And his friend says, well, no, it's actually not yellow. It's actually blue. The light just makes it appear to be yellow. So you're actually mistaken. And so David would say something like, well, I don't know what it would mean to be mistaken, right? He's never been mistaken in his life. He thinks that this idea of appearing, the locution of appearing, is a very odd thing indeed. And so he would say that, no, it's actually yellow. And his friend would actually bring the tie outside until where it changes back to blue. And then David would say something like, well, it actually changed colors when we brought it outside. And his friend replies somewhat oddly, well, wouldn't that be a strange thing that it just changed colors on us all of a sudden? Things don't just change properties like that. And so what David is doing right here is basically figuring out what an error is, right? He's developing the criterion of an error from typical everyday experiences. So the category of error, or the sort of understanding of error, only comes through a sort of opposition to typical seeings, to the locution of seeings, instead of just saying that we're just seeming seeings from the beginning. And so this is just one of the sort of examples that I wanted to offer, John, just to let them know where we're at. And I'm guessing you're going to go over the sort of content of our experience needs to be actually of something already external.
Yeah, and I'll stick to I'll use the example in that you brought up in laying that out too. I think because I think that was a really well laid out example. So let's see. In order to talk about what it is for our thought to have content, and so what it is for our thought to be about something, we would want to distinguish, let's say in the case of looking at a bow tie and it's seeming yellow, we would want to distinguish between some sort of merely descriptive process, some sort of process in which all that's happening is there's just a flux of sensations inside of me, and I am in some way reacting to those sensations. I am making further mental changes, let's say, having certain mental states, thoughts in response to that flux of sensations. And all that's going on is just one thing happening after another, a sort of sequence of events, as it were, where those events are just sensations. Here we have a very Humean picture of what experience would be. In that kind of picture, there's no such thing as content and no such thing as the possibility of failure. If your character David is merely having this flux of yellow sensations wash over him, there's just a yellow, and even describing it as yellow is me introducing some sort of possibility of error. But if there just is the sensations that he's having at that moment, whatever those sensations are, and those sensations then lead to David, picking up the bow tie and doing something with it, and you have basically a sequence of events involving sensations and behavior, including mental behavior, let's say, changes in mental states. Then you don't have any sense in which David is even thinking that the bow tie is yellow or thinking of the bow tie that it is yellow. There's no content to his mental states. His mental states are just events in the world. They're just things that are happening that involve sensations. He not only won't experience error, but he actually can't be in error because there's nothing for him to be in error about. And this kind of life that he would be living would be a life in which he indeed is not thinking about anything. It would be he would only have a place in what we might say from the outside, a causal picture of the world, and not a place in a normative picture of the world, we might say. Now, the question, in order for then to go from that picture of David, where he just has these sensations happening in sequence, maybe they're constantly conjoined in some way, again, it's a very Humean picture, in order to go from that picture to a picture in which he is thinking of the bow tie, that it is yellow, we need to introduce some kind of, actually, let me put this a little bit different way than I was going to. There needs to be some way that he is not merely reacting to sensations, that this is not a merely causal process. Something has to be added into the picture.
Right.
And what needs to get added into the picture is a way in which his sensations and mental states and his reactions to those sensations is beholden to or directed towards an object in some way, which is to say, there has to be a object that figures ineliminably in his mental state itself, in this case his thoughts, which now are in fact about the object um, that which are now about the object that figures in those mental states in that way, which provides them with content. And now, in order for that to be possible, and actually, I can maybe just say what I'm about to say now, even independently of everything I just said about an object figuring ineliminably, there has to be a way of distinguishing within the causal picture that I was describing earlier between or rather I should say identifying which among the causes of those sensations are specifically the objects of those sensations.
So to interrupt you real quick, right? We could have an object right in front of us, or we could think that we have an object in front of us, and we think that we might have some sort of causal theory of reference, that there is some sort of causal mishap of some sort, or just sort of causally efficacious thing occurring, such that it presents us a certain type of object. But we need to be able to distinguish between that type of causal explanation and another type of causal explanation, and which one we ought to attribute towards the object showing itself to us, right? So in order to do that, we need now to introduce the concept of normativity or justification, and being able to justify which out of these causal explanations for our perceptual seeings we should endorse.
Exactly, and certainly normativity is crucial for this to be knowledge. Interestingly, and I think crucial to the sort of basic point, at least of the move that I'm sketching out here, this move from a Humean picture of mere causation to a normative picture of relation to objects, you might say, of having thoughts about that are about objects, is a further non-normative step, I think, which comes into play here, or at least there's a non-normative problem that has to be solved by the normative picture, and that actually makes the normative picture indispensable to a correct account of human experience.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's very important that the problem is introduced prior to any talk of normativity, and that only the normativity can solve the problem.
Okay.
And this is actually, in fact, where Davidson enters the picture. So Davidson identifies what later Davidsonians, and I believe actually Davidson also uses similar words to this, or at least he doesn't name them in such a grand way, but Davidson identifies these two problems that need to be solved by any account of how it is that our thoughts get their content. And these problems are nowadays called the aspect problem and the distance problem. Now, the distance problem is much more straightforward. When it comes to the Humean picture I was describing earlier, where you just have some causal sequence of some causal, it need not be causal, but we can talk in terms of causation, some sort of sequence of events, some sort of a bunch of events, you might say a bundle of events or whatever, just a ton of events that are related causally or spatially or temporally or what have you. And among those in particular are these sensations, which we might, in a sort of biological mode, describe as just stimulations of the sensory surfaces of an organism. In order for an organism which is having those stimulations of its sensory surfaces to specifically identify an object for those sensations that the organism is having to point to an object or to be about an object, it would be necessary for the causes for the, I should say, for the subject to identify amongst all the causes of those sensations, from the moment of those sensations back to the heat, back to the Big Bang, basically, that somewhere between those 2 points, at some distance from the subject, that's why it's the distance problem, the object is located.
And just to let you know, by the way, we just suddenly got 32 people that just joined us right now, John.
Oh,
So just to introduce the topic back on to everyone who just now started watching, we're going over Kant, Davidson, and Sellars' views on skepticism and how to sort of address these. And right now we're moving from sensations, that is just to have the sort of bundle of different types of sensations that are neither right or wrong, to the criterion of what is right and wrong, what is an illusion versus reality, and how to sort of defeat or debate against the skeptic of external objects, or the external objects. So sorry for cutting you off right there, John.
no, that was a great summary. No problem. So where was I? Yeah, so I was laying out, right. So yeah, as you nicely put it, right, there's how do you go from merely having sensations, or how do you go from a picture in which people are merely having sensations, and those sensations are just happening in some sequence, to a picture on which you have people who are thinking about objects and whose thoughts are then right or wrong on the basis of whether or not those objects are the way that they think they are. In other words, how do you go from having mere sensations to having contentful thought? And
Right.
the problem that I've laid out here for this, at least this one Davidsonian problem, which is I described as a problem because it's something which an account of content, of how our thought has content, has to be able to solve. It has to have it has to account for, has an account of how that problem is avoided. And this problem is the distance problem, as I described it. This problem of how, among the infinite variety of causes of a particular sensation that you're having at a particular moment, is identified as specifically the object that those that the thoughts in which those sensations figure, or the thought in which those sensations figure, is a thought about some specific object somewhere in that causal chain back to infinity, back to the Big Bang. And so, let's think of this in a particular case, right? So even just in the case here where I'm sitting here looking at my bookcase, and I take myself to be looking at my bookcase, I'm having contentful thoughts. But in order for me to have those contentful thoughts, it must be the case that I don't just have my retina being stimulated in a way which produces these mental images of what looks like all the books that I have here. It must be the case that somewhere between the stimulation of my retina, maybe you want to go a little bit further ahead, somewhere between my, occipital lobe processing of visual stimuli, or some other kind of processing going on in the cortex, somewhere between that mere event in a causal story and the retinal stimulation, and then the light passing from the books on the shelf, and the light reflecting off the books on the shelf, and the same light, coming from the light bulb in my room, the light production of light by that light bulb being produced by electricity running through a tungsten filament. I mean, somewhere, and that you could just keep extending the process to a further and further distance from me and my cortical processing. Somewhere in there is the bookshelf, which my thoughts are about. But in order for my thoughts to be about that bookshelf, I have to there has to be a way in which my thoughts are directed towards only that one part of that entire causal chain, namely the part where the bookshelf itself is, amongst other features the bookshelf has, and the features that I'm thinking about. Maybe I'm thinking about it having a, 6 or whatever shelves in it, or something like that. And so that's in a nutshell the distance problem. It's how it is that your thought is specifically directed to that one point in an infinite, or at least quite lengthy and infinitely branching, we might say, causal chain, since at any one of those stages, I could have gone in a different direction. So the Davidson's idea here, and this is more in his later works than in his earlier works, is that that problem needs to be solved to have in order for content to be possible. It's basically a condition of the possibility of contentful thought is that your thoughts have some way of distinguishing between all those infinite possibilities, or at least of selecting amongst all those infinite possibilities, of course, without going through them. In fact, it would be impossible to get outside your head to do that anyway.
And so, do you think a solution to this is an anti-foundationalist thesis, or do you have some foundationalist ideas about where to sort of begin on the discrimination between these different types of ideas and where they would be sort of compartmentalized? Or would you just basically say that, we would hold a sort of anti-foundationalist view and that we already seem to be in a already seem to have a certain sense of beliefs of where I would place this object and what that type of object is?
That's a good question. I frankly don't often find there to be much importance. It's going to sound very strange, but I don't find there to be much importance in distinguishing foundationalism and coherentism, amongst other possibilities, as different approaches to epistemic normativity, as a different approach to what it is that justifies our beliefs.
So just to kind of give, again, an idea of what these topics mean for the audience, just a foundationalist thesis of justification versus an anti-foundationalist, say, coherentist view. A foundationalist thesis is just going to say that there's some sort of foundation to how our beliefs are generated that we can go back to that serves as a foundation for all other beliefs, as opposed to a coherentist thesis, which is just going to say that the way I justify my beliefs is through another belief, and that belief through another belief, or through a battery of beliefs, coherently kind of interwoven as a web or a sort of a closed circle. And you seem to be saying that these two theses are not at odds with themselves, right?
Yeah, exactly. And as I said, the claim there is, I think, quite an odd one, but I think it makes sense on a pragmatist account of normativity in general. Since my basic approach to this would be to say that, depending on the context, we operate in exactly the way the foundationalist says that we operate, and that certain beliefs or certain other contentful states are acting as unquestioned foundations, as self-justifying, you might even say, foundations. Whereas then in other cases, we are not operating in that way, and in fact, we are exploring these larger webs of justificatory relations and only finding justification in the specific belief being evaluated because it coheres nicely with that larger web. And it just depends on the pragmatic context, basically, on what it is that we're doing.
Okay. Do you have anything more to say on this issue? Did you want to continue that?
Certainly has a lot more to say. Maybe we can save that for another time.
Okay, we can answer some questions here in the meantime while we think about other things, because we definitely have a lot at this point.
I know, yeah, it's been just flooding. Let's see.
Let's go up. You probably don't see all these, so I'll just read them out loud to you, going all the way up here to the first question. I guess I don't know how much you know about postmodernism. Okay, and this is maybe a comment. No such thing as objective reality and no way of knowing it. Someone made a comment on postmodernism, but we never brought up postmodernism, so just to sort of remind the audience that Kant isn't endorsing the idea that there is no such thing as an objective reality, that there is no way of knowing reality. So there's a way
quite the opposite. Yeah.
Yeah, there's precisely the opposite is that he's trying to find tools, cultivating tools to know it in certain types of ways that we can't be skeptical of, is the entire project. The idea of the noumenon as a sort of world that we don't have epistemic access to, or if you want to say, ontological axis as well, is not to say that that's in opposition to our appearances or experiences, and that this is the real world and we're always barred from it. Um, it's just that this is just another aspect of a view that human beings just don't know anything about. But an identity with things that we do know about, in the same way that, say, a cat, doesn't know everything that there is about a laptop, but that doesn't mean that they're not seeing an actual laptop. They are seeing the laptop, they just don't know exactly what it means to be a laptop. So the first question here is, can you reconcile perspectivism with an outside world with a quantitative notion of reality based on difference rather than qualitative traits? I'm not really sure what that means. Do you know what that means, John?
Well, I take it the perspectivism is referring to my perspectival reading of Transcendental Idealism.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not and correct me if I'm wrong, user whose name I can't pronounce because there's mostly consonants in it. When you're saying a quantitative notion of reality based on difference rather than qualitative traits, I mean, certainly the quantitative qualitative distinction is, I'm reading that as some sort of it sounds very similar to what people talk about in terms of some measurable difference between the truth of two different claims, or some measurable difference between just two things, let's say, two things that we're claiming to exist. If that's what you have in mind, then I would say that this kind of perspectivalism that I'm endorsing here, this sort of this idea that our access to the objects that we experience, the objects that exist outside of us, are objects that exist as a relation between the way the subject is in itself and the way those same objects, are in themselves. And where the relation involves the subject having a perspective on something which has a way it is in itself. That perspectivalism involves, to the extent that it involves a commitment to objective reality, which it does, absolutely. The objective reality does indeed take on a very quantitative form. A lot of the objective items, these items which are available not just to me, this one subject, but to any myriad of other subjects, each of whom has their own perspective on the same objects. The sense in which there's something shared is often going to be quantitative, right? There's going to be measurable differences that me or that Marty or that someone else could come in and come to the same conclusions about. We could, in other words, make the same measurements and compare measurements in some way. That said, I don't know if I would say that eliminates. It's certainly compatible with that. So you could say this, and there's nothing more than that. All that there is that is objective in these perspectival in this perspectival ontology, in this idea that objects just exist from a perspective. You could say the only objective features of those perspectival objects are the ones that are measurable. That's compatible with the view that I presented. But likewise, it is also compatible with saying that there are indeed some qualitative features as well, and indeed some non-measurable, not even non-descriptive features that can be available to multiple different subjects. And so in other words, part of the objective furniture of the world, as it were. So it's compatible with both of those things. It doesn't really commit, this perspectivalism doesn't commit to any particular take on the question of, is everything measurable or something like that. Oh, you're clarifying. So like if you talk about color, you say you can be sure of similar notions of spatial instance, number of instances. Interesting. Certainly, yes, there will always be part of the objective furniture of the world are spatial relations, which are geometric and quantifiable. part of the objective furniture of the world is the number of things of different types. Now, of course, how it is that counting is grounded, what grounds the truth of counting is maybe a separate question, which would take us on a huge tangent through Frege. But certainly, yeah, all of those things I would say are part of the objective furniture of the world.
Do we want
If
to
you
move on
contrast,
yeah, let's bypass this question for just right now.
okay, I do want to answer Agnes Domini's question though, because I noticed that it was actually asked earlier as well, and
Right.
didn't get a chance to get to it. The short answer, Agnes Domini, is that there's enormous scholarly disagreement on what exactly Kant's position is. Some will read Kant as a phenomenalist, like Berkeley. I don't mean that Berkeley reads Kant that way. I just mean that some will read Kant as being like Berkeley in that way. Some will read Kant as a constructivist in ontology, as thinking that the objects that exist are constructed in a certain way, similar to like Rudolf Carnap's view, for example, in the Aufbau.
Do you still have that chart, by the way, John, of all the different various positions on Kant? I know there was like one that sort of gives a two worlds, dual aspect, phenomenalist, then like substance distinctions and crazy other interpretations. But I remember there being a chart posted on the philosophy chat. If you have that we can pull up.
Oh, I wonder. Yeah, it would take me a while to sift through the channels to find that. I think there's something of that sort on the SEP. If you go to the article on Kant's Transcendental Idealism.
Let's see if we can find it so we can pull it up.
But yeah, Agnes Domini, it's a huge scholarly mess, I think, is how I would put it. It's just very unclear what Kant's view is, and not partially because Kant is not a very good writer, partially because he's actually in some sense too clear, too precise would be more accurate in the way that he frames things, at least just huge run-on sentences. He's very attentive to nuanced differences, which leads to apparently contradictory claims across even a single work. And so there's a lot of debate, and there's just interpretive debates about like how do you interpret a philosopher or anyone really? Do you try to minimize contradictions? Do you take contradictions for granted? That kind of stuff. So it's not just you. It's just a mess.
I found the various different types of interpretations. I'll post it here in just a second. While I do that, there is another question. I want to read the Critique of Pure Reason, but it seems, and this is by Duders 123, but it seems like such an intimidating book to tackle outside of a guided lecture. I have read the Prolegomena and his moral writings, but would you suggest a companion reader or a lecture series that would help me with better breaking down the CPR?
Okay, yeah. I mean, you read the Prolegomena. That would be the first thing that I would have recommended. So that's great. Having the Prolegomena with you when you read the Critique of Pure Reason is also not a bad idea. There are great companion readers like the Cambridge Companion to Kant, and more specifically the Cambridge Companion to Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Those are two separate books, and the second one is, I would say, quite helpful. It's a little bit scholarly and difficult, but it's among the more accessible ones, I would say. Any further recommendations I would make would involve me recommending someone who adopts a particular interpretive stance, which isn't to say that the Cambridge Companions don't, but it's spread amongst different authors, and there's much more attention to discussing the multiple views in terms of the options that seem available, at least. Probably though, what's the most neutral and careful companion reader I'd recommend is Graham Bird's The Revolutionary Kant. It of course adopts a particular interpretive stance, but it is unbelievably careful in surveying the possibilities and relating what Kant is saying to concerns in modern philosophy, especially analytic, but a little bit of continental, I believe, too. And that's probably what I recommend. It's of course a huge book since it's a detailed commentary on the critique of pure reason, um, and it can get quite technical too. So it may, in that regards, still be not the best option. Um, Personally, I'm a huge fan of Lucy Elias's work on Kant, and so her interpretation of Kant, since it's a very her book Manifest Reality, which I'd recommend, is very partisan in that way. It is clearly staking out a claim, but it does survey the different positions very in a very charitable way, and it addresses in staking out a position, it addresses why the other positions are worse or perhaps even can't work at all. So that's
Just
probably my main recommendation.
Yeah, I just posted the various different positions that you can take within Kant. Apparently, they're going to break them down to phenomenalist and anti-phenomenalist, and then
Mm.
identity and non-identity, and then epistemic versus metaphysical identities. I also posted the Graham Bird commentary on the Critique of Pure Reason, which Johann has recommended. Um, yeah. So let's move on to the next question.
All right. Yep. No problem, duders.
Looks like we got a lot of comments on Nietzsche. Nietzsche called him a cunning Christian, and he was right. Humanism is just cultural Christianity with extra steps. The entire North Atlantic ontology is just an excuse for colonialism and slavery, really. Okay.
Mm. I don't
um,
know much to say about Nietzsche or that.
yeah, I don't know if I have too much to say on it.
Yeah,
Um,
I frankly just don't know enough.
so yeah, I don't know too much about on this idea of colonialism. I'm sure it has maybe some merit. So another comment: to arrive at a norm of perceptual interpretation necessitates some post priori info instances to a priori framework, but the instance is self-encapsulating. For deductive reason to derive anything, a claim would have to be associated with the instance and was what was his experience. Okay, I'm guessing he meant to say what is the experience, and any post a priori for a matter open-ended enough to allow for a derived truth. I think he's just basically saying that there's two components here, and I mean we can kind of summarize this as a sort of receptivity and a spontaneity in Kantian language. There's sort of some sort of a priori framework, and I guess to where we make inferences and some sort of receptivity towards actual empirical content.
Yeah. The experience brings together the a priori and the a posteriori. That seems, I think, quite reasonable. And it was more or less the picture I was sketching out earlier that there's sensations which are empirical, and then there's the a priori conditions of experience, and both of those figure in experience as a whole.
A lot more comments. Not, I don't think we have any more questions. Actually, I don't think we have any more questions.
Oh, the person who with all the consonants who had talked about those two features is saying in what way experience is in itself and can't be derived. Okay. Yeah, admittedly, I'm not sure what to say in response to that, but
What's the question?
um,
I'm not seeing this question.
oh, it's the last one. Someone saying I was saying experience is in itself and can't be derived, and that's a clarification of their earlier comment that you just read a moment ago.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure what he means by experience in itself being derived.
Is this related to coherentism? You mentioned deductions. Is a derivation from place in a web of belief or through connections by deductive reasoning?
He's gonna have to probably clarify that a little bit more for us.
Yeah, fair enough.
So do we have anything else to talk about skepticism? There was this one issue. I'm not sure if you have any sort of robust answers for it. But
Mm.
with, for example, the Sellarsian example that I gave earlier, um, McDowell talks about it in one YouTube video, and he still says that Sellars is wrong in his assessment of how we come to vertical experience about objects. He says that even if we move from typical examples and then you know address untypical examples, we introduce the category of error. He still thinks that these typical examples are going to be, I guess, dependent upon some sort of sense organs that are working in a, uh, I'm guessing, in a correct way, so we can
Mm.
get this type of information. But that seems to be sort of also question begging in the sense like, well, how do we know
Mm.
what the correct or standard or typical view is? And how do we know that when our sense organs are just sort of getting at these original notions of experience, that these should be, we should begin with these being, typical in any sort of way? Why should we even assume that? Do you have any sort of answer or an objection to that?
Well, I think you're right to say that it's question begging. Um, I would say that it becomes quite trivial to resolve. I mean, certainly what you just described sounds like an anti-skeptical position as opposed to a skeptical one. But it would be trivial to have an answer to what it is that our thoughts and experiences are directed towards, what they're about, what their content is, if you have access to biological teleology. So if you have an account on which certain biological processes, like the stimulation of sensory organs, the processing of those stimulations in the cortex, if you have such an account of the purpose of those,